Welcome to our Learn at Lunch webinar series. We produced this series with the support from the Farm Service Agency, and an FSA grant allows us to create and compile a number of other farm management resources that may be found on the farm management website. I will paste here in a little bit the link to this site into the chat box in the lower right corner. If you have any questions for the presenters, please type them into the chat box, and a presenter will answer the question at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar is slightly different. It will feature 3 extension professors discussing different aspects of today's topic. I'll turn it over to the presenters now.
Well, thank you, Brent. This is Dr. Rodney Jones, and I'm from the Agricultural Economics Department, and I'm going to kick this webinar off with a little bit of an overview, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Marburger and Dr. Lofton to talk about some more of the mechanical aspects associated with managing something here in Oklahoma on 50 acres of cropland. And I want to just say right here from the start that don't take that 50-acre number literally. We are using that as an example number here, referring to anything that we would consider to be small acreage crop production in Oklahoma. And depending on where you're at in the state of Oklahoma or surrounding regions, that's probably anything under about a couple of hundred acres in many instances. So it could be 40 or 50 or 80 acres or some other small cropland acreage, and we're just kind of going to talk about what some of the possibilities are. So why the interest in this topic? That long-term trend of interest in small-scale agriculture has not slowed. If anything, in many areas it is increasing, and we're getting more and more questions about what the possibilities are for small acreage agriculture. And some examples of where that might fit would be just somebody wanting to live on a small acreage. Perhaps they bought 40 or 50 acres and they have a nice house, and they like to live in the country, but they're working at another job, and they're just wondering what to do with the cropland that's on that small acreage. Or perhaps it could be somebody retiring to a small acreage. Many instances we have people ask questions because they've inherited a piece or maybe all of their grandfather's home place, for example. They may want to live there. They may just want it for recreational purposes, but perhaps it has some cropland associated with it. So what are they going to do with it? And finally, we have people calling periodically with an interest in intensive small acreage crop agriculture. So we want to address the topic from kind of each of those perspectives. So to start off with here, let's have a little bit of a discussion about what's realistic. You've got this small acreage of cropland, and you see what your neighbors are doing, other crop producers around you, and in many areas of the state, as you drive down the road, you're going to see conventional crops that are grown in Oklahoma, and you're wondering what you could earn by devoting your small acreage to that type of agriculture. Or alternatively, you remember when you were much younger, and now it's 50 years later, and you've always had a passion for that agricultural environment that you grew up in. And I just want to warn you that things have changed dramatically. Those of us who have been involved in it all of our lives, that change has kind of occurred gradually, but when we look back 30, 40, 50 years, things have changed dramatically, and what was economically viable 30, 40, 50 years ago may very well not be economically viable anymore. And the big important point here is that there are huge economies of scale in particularly machinery ownership and operation in agriculture today. Economies of scale simply means that you have to be of a certain size to be able to be cost competitive in engaging in some activity. And it's a simple fact today that there are massive economies of scale in most of our traditional equipment ownership and operation. Modern equipment, modern technology is simply designed to be run over a tremendous number of acres to capture the full use value of it. So if you're going to try to farm a small acreage of commonly grown conventional crops in Oklahoma, and I'll throw out a few examples here, just conventional wheat, soybeans, corn, grain sorghum, you could think of others. You're going to find that to be a pretty uphill battle if you're going to try to own any significant portion of the machinery complement and do that work yourselves. One exception to that we might throw in the category of conventionally grown crops in Oklahoma that Josh is going to talk about a little bit later might perhaps be alfalfa hay put up in small sellable packages. But we're going to relegate that to kind of a different category for today because it's kind of an example in and of itself. However, with that said, you're probably not going to go out and buy a line of equipment, even an older line of equipment, and farm 50 or 80 or 100 acres of wheat or soybeans or grain sorghum on your own. That doesn't mean you can't generate some income from your acreage through a couple of different alternatives. The first one here is you might enter into a rental arrangement with a good local farmer, or you might hire some of those field operations done that, like I mentioned, you're probably not going to be able to afford the machinery to do them on your own, but you can enter into a rental arrangement with a good local farmer, or you can hire those field operations done by someone else. Now, I'm going to talk about the first one of those first, entering into a rental arrangement with a good local farmer. And an entire webinar could and probably will at some future date be devoted to choosing a good tenant. I'll leave that for a future discussion, but let's suffice it to say I'm quite confident that there are good alternatives in about every local community in Oklahoma. But I do need to talk about various rental arrangements that would be available if you were to choose that option, just to garner some income to help pay the taxes and maybe upkeep expenses on a particular piece of property and keep it in good shape. The two common types of rental arrangements that we have in Oklahoma would be cash rent arrangements, where the owner receives a fixed dollar amount of cash rent every year, and those details are agreed to beforehand between the owner and the tenant. Depending on geographic area, quality of the land, it's quite common to see cash rents for cropland range from down in that $30 an acre area up to maybe as high as $70 an acre. I've even heard examples more than that for dryland cropland. That's going to be very geographically specific and land quality specific, and your best sources of information for what cash rental rates for your particular piece of ground that you might be looking at would be local sources, industry professionals in your local area, local extension professionals, and local industry professionals such as lenders or local producers, for that matter, would be your best source of information with regard to a specific parcel of land. The other common type of rental arrangement is going to be the crop share rental arrangement, and that's where the owner receives a share of the crop and usually pays some component of the operating expenses. And again, the details are agreed upon between the owner and the tenant. Crop share rental arrangements happen to be more common in the southern plains and specifically in Oklahoma than they are in many other regions of the United States. And that may be changing over time, but right now crop share arrangements are still relatively common in the geographic area where we find ourselves. An example of a crop share rental arrangement might be the owner of the property might get 1/3 of the crop production, let's say a 36 bushel wheat crop. So the owner would get 12 bushels of wheat, sell it for $4 a bushel. That'd be a gross return of $48, but they would also be required to pay perhaps 1/3 of the fertilizer, and maybe in this case that happened to be $10. So they netted $38 an acre on that particular piece of ground that particular year through a crop share rental arrangements. And again, an entire webinar could be devoted to various rental arrangements for cropland in agriculture, and in fact we have one scheduled on January 30th that I'm sure will touch on some of those issues. But from a sheer economic comparison perspective, the big differences are as follows. Cash renting results in less income variability for the landowner. You have a contract. The tenant's going to pay me so much per year on a certain date. That's a guaranteed income stream. Whereas crop share rental arrangements might result in some quote-unquote home runs, some really good years. In the example that I had up there earlier, what if the crop had been a 65 bushel wheat crop and sold for $7.50 a bushel back in one of the really good years from a price perspective, and happened to have a good yield year? Obviously, the landlord's going to come out ahead in that situation. But you could also have a quote-unquote strikeout. You could have a bad year under a crop share rental arrangement as a landlord. I'm going back to for wheat production in Oklahoma, say a 2007 or a 2009, or in many areas of the state a 2011, where we had some serious production challenges, and in many cases didn't raise a crop at all, or if we did, very small yielding crop, or a low price year. So a lot more variability with crop share renting. And one of the other issues that comes up with crop share rental arrangements is when different crops or more intensive crop rotations are involved in the operation of the land, determining the appropriate crop split or expense split can become very complicated, because that's a mathematical calculation based on who's contributing what to the cropping enterprise, and that question of who's contributing what is answered differently depending on whether you're growing wheat or soybeans or corn or many other crops. So when you're switching from one crop to another, or when there are some double crops incorporated into the rotation, determining that fair crop split can be very complicated. And that's one reason why many other regions of the country have moved to much more dependence on cash renting arrangements. And in fact, I think we're seeing that trend begin in Oklahoma as well. But regardless of the arrangement type, whether it be a cash rental arrangement or a crop share arrangement, there's some legal considerations that need to fall into place. Again, an entire webinar could be devoted to those legal considerations, but the bottom line is get the rental arrangement in writing. And there are many templates and a broad source of information out there to help people do that. The second alternative, if you just want to garner a little bit of income off of a piece of cropland and have it farmed sort of in a conventional way, the traditional crops grown in your area, might be to just hire those machinery operations done, but maintain the management control. In other words, the landowner would decide what operations need to be done and when, and then just hire a custom operator, a local farmer with excess machinery capacity, for example, to come in and do whatever tillage operations need done, come in and do the planting operations, the harvesting operations, the spraying, etc. as needed. Now, since there is not a lot of labor involved in conventional crop agriculture anymore because of the size and scale of machinery, there's not a large return to the management aspect of farming. So if all you're maintaining is the management aspect, you're probably not going to garner a significant amount more income using this option than you would with simply renting it out to a good farmer in the community. But it does have some other attractive benefits. You get to market your own crops, so on and so forth. Scenario number 2 might be you envision using your small acreage to try to run a viable business and generate significantly more income for yourself per acre than you could get renting it out to a conventional crop producer, for example. So if that's the case, the possibilities are, of course, endless, but you need to consider something outside the scope of most of the conventional cropping opportunities that we see here in Oklahoma. A lot of the possibilities are going to be discussed over the next few minutes. But if you go down this road, it's going to require significantly more labor and or management and or marketing time per acre than would normally be invested in growing the conventional crops. And by the same token, that's what would result in potentially generating some financial rewards. In addition to that, a lot of these quote-unquote unconventional possibilities might involve taking on a little more risk or accepting a little more uncertainty in the long-term outcome. That, of course, is another thing that could potentially generate some higher than normal expected financial rewards on a per acre basis. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Marburger, and he's going to talk about some of the possibilities that we might see in the small grains area.
All right, thank you, Dr. Jones, and thank you for having me here this afternoon. Again, my name is David Marburger, and I'm the Small Grains Extension Specialist here at OSU. I've been here about a year and a half now, and I'm going to share with you some kind of my view of some of the options when it comes to small grains for producers here in Oklahoma. And I'm going to kind of break it out into keeping the theme with what Dr. Jones has set up, in which we'll kind of go through scenario 1, where we'll talk about some of more of the conventional options, and or maybe some of the expected returns and challenges associated with those, and then go into scenario 2, or taking our small grains and kind of trying to, what I'm going to describe as thinking outside of the box. Again, going along with a couple of things Dr. Jones mentioned in terms of maybe a little bit riskier, may take a little bit more time in marketing, might take more labor, but the financial reward might also be a lot better than some of our conventional options. And again, as Dr. Jones alluded to, these are just some scenarios that I've thrown out. I'm sure there are a lot more options, but these are the ones that I've come up for here today. And so I'm going to begin with, like I mentioned, the conventional scenario here. And when we think about Oklahoma, I'm sure it's not a surprise to many people that wheat is our biggest crop. So if we want to do what everyone else is doing, we can certainly grow wheat on some of our small acreage. Kind of one of the positives about the landscape here in Oklahoma with regards to wheat management is that we do have several options in which we can produce this wheat. For those who maybe like the cattle side of things a little bit better than going for grain, we do have some forage only options where we can just run cattle out on the wheat pasture and just let the cattle graze all the way out, or we could go ahead and let them graze and then later on take that forage and cut it for hay. We can do dual purpose where we're grazing the cattle through the winter time, then remove the cattle before we get deep into springtime, and let those plants go ahead and produce grain, so we can generate a couple of different, I guess, sources of income from one field. And then our grain only option where we're just going to plant it and we're going to go ahead and harvest it for grain. When it comes to kind of thinking about what's the expectations in wheat in Oklahoma, over about the past 10 years, our average yields in the state have been about, when looking at the state, have been about 30 bushel per acre. And so that's on the grain yield side. On the forage side, for the fall forage and going into the winter and grazing, usually we can get about a ton to a ton and a half of forage. When looking at the cattle side of it, well, in terms of stocking rates, you're going to be looking at 1 to 2 acres per stocker, or about 250 to 600 pounds of animal per acre. And with each animal, we can expect usually about 1.5 to 3 pounds of gain per day, and we might be grazing for maybe 90 to 100 days. So that should give you a little bit of a relative idea in terms of the amount of gain on the cattle side that we can get. And then on the grain yield side, I'll mention the challenge associated with that here soon, but the yield potential does present some challenges in it, and some of those actually come with the wheat inputs, what I have here listed. I put these inputs here just to give you an idea on what does it take to make a wheat crop, and this is kind of the bare minimum, but it will vary with what type of management option are you trying to focus on. I have the seed listed here in terms of bin run, farmer saved, and clean seed or certified seed. And from left to right, these actually go from the least expensive to the most expensive. So bin run seed, just literally pulling it out of a bin, putting it in the drill and going out and planting it, versus certified seed where has a known test weight, known germination. We know it's clean of foreign material and weed seed and all that. So there are some risks and challenges associated with each of these options. Seed treatments. Anymore, a lot of seed, especially if you're buying it certified, will have a seed treatment on it, but you don't necessarily have to have a seed treatment, and that may run you anywhere from $5 to $15 per bushel. On the seed side, I forgot to mention in terms of costs there, the bin run, it's not quite the cash price. You can have a little bit of storage and shrinkage associated with that, so maybe just a hair over cash price. And right now, probably a decent average for the state would be about $3.25 per bushel, up to certified seed, which might be 2 to 3 times that amount. For fertilizers, we would recommend using diammonium phosphate or DAP in a lot of scenarios, because a lot of our acres in the state have very low pH, and that can help us with getting good establishment out of the gate, and actually help us on the forage side for those who are interested in dual purpose and forage only production. So the typical recommendation there is 50 pounds per acre, and that may run you close to $10 per acre. Nitrogen fertilizer, it does vary the amount in which management option that you are doing. The overall recommendation is 2 pounds of nitrogen per expected bushel of grain. If you're in dual purpose, you'll need to have an additional nitrogen applied for the forage aspect of that, which is being removed by the cattle. And for every ton of forage expected, we need 60 pounds of nitrogen. So the nitrogen rates are going to vary there depending on your management option. And right now, depending on your source of nitrogen, will vary with the price, but it might be a good average. For right now, it might be somewhere in a quarter to maybe 35 cents per pound of nitrogen. And then on the pesticides, these will kind of depend too on what management option you're going for. If you're a forage only producer, you may not want to apply a herbicide. You might not actually enjoy a little bit of Italian ryegrass or some grassy weed species that are coming up with the wheat as well. Those are providing forage for you, but in a grain only situation, that is definitely going to hurt you at the end of the day on the grain yield. And then, are you battling any insects or any diseases and need to apply insecticide or fungicide? But herbicides can run, it can vary, and it can run anywhere from $15 to $30 per acre. Insecticides have gotten cheaper over the year, so we could get by with those for maybe just several dollars per acre. And the fungicides too, depending on the type of fungicide you would like to use, that may run you anywhere from $5 to up to $30, $40 per acre. So in thinking about just real quickly here on the economics on wheat, if we have a 30 bushel yield at 3 1/4, that's about $100 per acre gross. So in our 50 acre example, you're bringing in about $5,000 overall. And on just the input side of this, it may run you anywhere from $50 to $75, depending how much you're putting into it. So you can already see there the net income is not a whole lot. And then as Dr. Jones mentioned, on 50 acres, you may not have your own equipment, so you happen to have all this hired out, and so those are added costs as well, and that's going to eat into your net return. For the other small grains, I have the other small grains I'll be talking about are rye, triticale, which is actually a cross between wheat and rye, oats, and barley. In terms of acreage in Oklahoma, these combined here have less than 500,000 acres, with rye actually being the biggest of those four at probably about a quarter of a million. But of those, we don't really harvest a whole lot of these for grain. The rye, for example, we may only harvest a third of those acres. Yield potentials too are going to vary with each of these. Rye might be last year we were about 10 bushels under wheat in the state, where at about 25 bushels, and where wheat was at 34. Oats would be a little bit higher in terms of its yield potential. It's closer to 50 a couple of years ago. But even though the yield potential varies, the price is also varying in those as well. So actually our overall gross per acre actually is pretty close to wheat. Rye, for example, even though the yield potential was less, the price per bushel is actually more than wheat right now. That's where I was going with that. But overall in Oklahoma, these will probably be more of a forage focus. And in terms of the management, in a lot of ways, these are going to be pretty similar with some of the management aspects as that I've described a little bit with when it comes to wheat. Now, some of the challenges associated with scenario one here are conventional approach. One right now is the commodity prices. The wheat price has been very poor here the past couple of years, so that's really limiting us on our gross income per acre. Harvest operations, custom operations can add up quickly, depending how many times we need to make a pass over that field. That could add up very, very quickly, and that may cost you about $5, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe closer to $10, depending on what is being applied per acre. And then two, we've seen this a little bit over the past couple of years. It can be hard to implement our best management practices for trying to work towards maximizing our yield potential, both on the forage and the grain side, just because we're not grossing a lot of money. We have a lot of variability in our weather, so it's hard to know, are we going to have a decent year or are we going to have a very poor year? And if it's looking like the forecast says we might have a poor year, you don't really want to put a lot of money into this crop. And one example of this over the past couple of years has been in regards to nitrogen management, and not wanting to spend the money on nitrogen fertilizer. But in the end, that could end up hurting us on yield and then protein, which is something I'll mention here in a little bit. That was an overview of the first scenario. So now I'm going to go through a few what I see are some possibilities when thinking for scenario two here, or outside the box. And I wanted to lead off here with organic. And for each of these small grains that I mentioned, in theory, we can get these certified organic, both in grain production or on the forage side as well. But what does it mean to be certified organic? It boils down to the 2 bullet points I have there underneath. Organic, we cannot use synthetically made pesticides and fertilizers, and we cannot use GMO crops. So one common thing people don't typically understand is organic doesn't mean no use of pesticides. There are some pesticides that are certified organic that we can use to help combat, especially some of our disease pathogens and insects. But weed control is going to be very difficult when it comes to organic crops, especially some of our small grains. One positive for organic on the small grain side with regards to GMO crops is we don't have any commercially available GMO small grains. Now, it does take 3 years to become certified organic. So that is a challenge in itself in that transition period when you're trying to switch over your production practices, but not getting the reward of having that certified organic crop. There was also a certification fee associated with becoming organic. I do know there are some cost share programs available through the USDA that can help pay for those. This is going to be more intense management overall. On our wheat side, we could do, in our conventional theme, we could do wheat on wheat, as is done in a number of acres, but that is likely something we will not be able to do in an organic system with any of our small grains. It's going to be really difficult to do that and still try to control our weeds, and also finding ways to get nitrogen into the soil. As I mentioned, we can't use synthetically made fertilizers, which is what we rely on a lot here in Oklahoma with respect to our nitrogen management. So we need to insert crop rotation, especially a legume, into that rotation to help get us some of that nitrogen, and also find ways to keep the ground covered so that we can hopefully keep our weeds at bay. And that itself can present a challenge here in Oklahoma as one of our biggest limiting factors when it comes to crop production in the state is water availability. So now just to talk about just a couple of the small grains, each species, and present just a few different options for each. The first one I have here is contracting with a local or artisan baker for end use quality. So right now, for our wheat, we're not paid on quality per se. We're not at least given a premium or discounts based on certain baking and milling qualities if we take our wheat to the co-op. But if you have a local baker or an artisan baker who's interested in a certain variety that is known to have good baking and milling characteristics, and you can grow good quality grain in terms of where I'm going with that would be good test weight and good protein, we may be able to give you more a better price than the current cash price. White wheat, I debated on putting this actually in scenario 1 because we can do it as part of scenario 1. Most of our wheat in the state is hard red winter wheat, but we can grow hard white wheat, and we do mill hard white wheat in the state at Enid, but a lot of it is actually brought over the border from Kansas. Again, there may be an opportunity there to contract with somebody who prefers white wheat. White wheat actually has higher flour yields than red wheat, and you can make more of a whole grain product with white wheat without getting kind of that color that is associated, that red color associated with the red wheat varieties. High protein wheat. Over the past couple of years, the one thing I mentioned about the nitrogen management that has presented some challenges for us as we have run into low protein across the state, making that wheat a lot harder to market. So if you're able to find a variety that has been shown to have typically above average protein, we can do some management things to help get us a higher protein content than maybe what is being produced in the area, and then get a premium for that. This past year, I heard of one example of where protein content with 12% was bringing a 50 cent premium. End users typically like to see at least 11.5%, but we weren't hitting that target very well with a lot of our wheat in the state. So just a 12% protein content wheat was bringing 50 cents, and then every 0.1% above that was bringing in an additional 5 cents. So we can go after more protein. It is going to take more time and labor. It may take more trips across the field. It may take later applications of nitrogen, and that's just going to be being responsive to the growing season, and seeing that we need to keep spoon feeding this crop to make sure we can get this high protein content. Later applications around flowering, some work that Dr. Arnell has done has indicated it takes about 20 pounds of nitrogen to get 1% increase in protein content. And then two, with the protein, with going after high protein, a challenge associated with that could be making sure that premium is offered consistently. If we happen to get turned around on the wheat price and people start using or managing their nitrogen more optimally, we may have better protein content overall and may not have that premium being offered. If you're a cattle producer and want to stick with kind of more of the forage aspect, raising your cattle and as a grass-fed beef and selling that as grass-fed beef to maybe somewhere in the city might be an option. You see a lot of grass-fed beef when you go to different restaurants, and that might be an opportunity to get you a little bit better price than what's currently being offered on the beef side. And then also with wheat, contracting with local microbreweries. One example here is Iron Monk Brewery here in Stillwater is actually making beer using the Gallagher wheat variety, with I believe wheat malt coming from the 46 Grain Company out of Ames. So there might be an option to contract with a local microbrewery and supplying them the grain they need to make beer. To kind of keep the alcohol theme going, leave it up to us humans. If we can find a way to make alcohol out of something, we will do it. But with barley, you can go and maybe produce barley for animal feed for somebody local and who may be willing to give you a little bit better price than what's currently being offered out on the market. Or going after and growing a malting barley variety. When it comes to barley, we have two different varieties in terms of how the spikelets on the seed head are arranged, and these are, you hear 2-row and 6-row barley, and typically more malting barleys are going to be the 2-row variety, and that's because typically 2-row barleys will have a lower protein content, so that means we have more starch content in the seed, and we can make we have more sugars there available to make alcohol out of. So again, contracting with a local brewery and providing them with malting barley might be an option. But one challenge with that might be finding a preferred malting barley variety. These may not be as well adapted for Oklahoma. Rye, similar to wheat, maybe contracting with a local baker or an artisan baker who's interested in producing, making rye bread. And again, contracting with somebody who's interested in brewing their own beer or working with a distillery in terms of producing whiskey. But these can be hard markets to find, especially maybe closer to where you're at without having to ship that grain very far. And depending on the size of the person you'd like to work with 50 acres, you may not be able to meet the demand of that buyer. And also storing that grain with wheat in a conventional system, we can just harvest it, have it harvested and delivered maybe to the local co-op and either store it there and sell it later or just sell it right away. But with these, it can be hard to find maybe storage for that in terms of if the baker or the brewery that you're maybe working with doesn't need it right away, then you need to find somewhere to store that grain and then keep the quality of that grain while it's being stored. And then finally here, just talk a little bit about oats. One going after animal feed, and the example here I have is for horses, and this is something Dr. Lofton shared with me yesterday as a producer near Tulsa. Actually grows oats, and that's what he does, and he sells those to the local or the horse people at the track near Tulsa. So again, kind of a niche market, and being able to secure that market and being able to meet the demand of those buyers could be difficult. Or you could go for food grade oats. Unfortunately, we're a little more limited on our options in terms of those varieties, but maybe you live somewhere near an end user who is using oats, maybe for flour, or maybe for someone who produces something, for example, like granola bars or something. You might be able to produce for them, or someone interested in what I have listed here, using varieties with increased beta glucans. That's a focus for oat breeders, is breeding varieties that have an increased concentration of beta glucans, which are polysaccharides that help make up a lot of the soluble fiber in oats, and that's been shown to reduce cholesterol. So having an increased content in that. But again, it may be limited in options in terms of varieties. And on the beta glucan example, I only know of one variety on the market, but this variety is only available up north and may not be one that may perform as well here in Oklahoma. And then some of the other challenges, again, very similar to some of those that I mentioned, and then the last one I have there is meeting the food grade requirements when it comes to oats. The biggest challenge there might be the test weight. A bushel of oats is 38 pounds per bushel, but a lot of times when we grow oats for grain, we may only hit 34 or 35 pounds per bushel, and if you don't meet that minimum that might be set by that end user, then you've lost out on capturing that higher reward that you were going after in the first place. So just to kind of summarize my side on the small grains, there are a lot of options when it comes to what we call kind of the conventional side. It is lower, might be a less amount of work, but you can't be expecting big returns on that with 50 or even 100 or a couple hundred acres. For options outside of the box, these are a little bit riskier. Might take much more time, be a little bit more intense. Might require more time on the marketing side, but the potential for higher returns is greater. So with that, that's all I have for today. Feel free to ask any questions as I'll be on here. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Josh Lofton.
Thanks, David. Yeah, a lot of good options there, and what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of continue down that road, talking about various other options that aren't necessarily within the small grains arena. Overall, what I have to say is when doing research, to put this presentation together, if I were a person that had 50 acres that I was looking to make some money on, I'd first probably step into the horticultural arena. Kind of looking at things that are produced by Texas and New Mexico, University of Arkansas, and all those other things. That kind of is the market that kind of is best suited. Heirloom tomatoes. We got two nice markets for fresh produce and all that in Oklahoma City and Tulsa. And then, the Dallas-Fort Worth, Wichita, Kansas City is not too far. So depending on where you are in Oklahoma, that probably would be your best option for alternative crops in a small acreage scenario. But let's go down the path to say that we wanted to do something that was more traditional big ag. We didn't want to do something that was horticultural or maybe small scale production. We wanted to be a part of that big ag scene, more field crop oriented, and that's kind of where we wanted to go. Kind of echoing some of the points that Rod made a little bit earlier. And the question becomes, why can't we make our traditional systems work? And he talked about the economics of scale. And typically the cost of entry is where you get stuck. A combine running, $500,000, $600,000, big tractors running a couple $100,000, planters, et cetera, et cetera. So you see yourself getting into $1 million, $1.5 million hole before you even get started. And then your return on investments is quite a bit longer than the potential you have with some small acres to kind of keep your head afloat. The other thing is that when we even see it a challenge with big acre producers is that much of your competition has had decades of experience doing the crops, marketing those crops, and being able to get those crops in a manner that kind of fits with their system. So breaking into it has some challenges associated with just inexperience, especially if this is really new to you. And I always have to say that every piece of land has some baggage with it. It's not just a piece of land. We're talking about drainage needs, fertility needs, maybe has some bad spots, maybe a weed issue out in the field. So we have to kind of overcome that, and looking at some of our big traditional crop systems, they might not financially be the most viable things. So the question is, okay, so we have to shove those away. Where else could we go? Well, if you don't want to really change the world or do something completely different, something as very similar as our forage systems might be the best option. When we talk about capital investment or the cost of getting started, it can be a little bit lower than our cropping systems. And usually if you're in a big forage production area, you have neighbors that are running forage. Maybe you could get, if you didn't want to invest in infrastructure right off the bat, you could get some neighbors to come in and cut, rake, and bale some of your forage systems. But whenever you start to kind of make that move and you want to go that direction, getting a small scale baler, rake, and cutter are a lot cheaper and really can go on a lot smaller scale. Trying to find a planter that isn't 12, 16, or 24 row planter out there in today's world is a lot more difficult than finding a cutter, rake, and a baler that works on 5 feet. So that capital investment can be a little bit lower. Also, the seed cost is comparatively a little bit lower, especially when we talk about improved pasture. Your upfront cost might be more expensive. Let's say you do something like alfalfa that we'll talk about. You might be paying $300 to $500 for a bag of seed that might only plant an acre or two, but you can typically get 4 to 8 years worth of a crop off of that little bit of investment. And so when we talk about it on a per acre basis, it's a little bit upfront, but when we talk about it on a system and you're talking about multiple years down the road, you're making that investment to the system. That way your input cost is substantially lower on years to come. So when we talk about hay, we can talk about all sorts of hay production, native range hay. We can talk about Bermuda grass pastures, various other pastures. One that has the potential is alfalfa. And it's just a really strong crop for Oklahoma. There's many that have been quite successful with growing alfalfa in the state. And it doesn't take a whole lot of acres to make alfalfa work. This is what's different than more of your traditional haying systems. Working on a large-scale Bermuda grass hay or something along those lines, you need a little bit of acres to work. Well, if you only have, let's say, 50 to work with, you can actually make alfalfa work really good. The standard equipment usually should suffice, so it's a lot higher quality, maybe a lot higher return hay, but you don't need anything special or anything excessive. Management's pretty straightforward, but it is intensive. We're talking about getting the crop established, making sure that you get weeds and insects out of it. Is a lot more intensive than some of our grasses that we could use as hay. So you have that once again, you got to get boots on the ground. You got to get out in those alfalfa fields and actually kind of manage them a little more strong-handedly than you do some of your other grass or hay meadows. The big thing against alfalfa, and this is kind of the last I'll say about it, is you need a market. Most of the time you sell to direct end users, and so you got to find somebody that needs alfalfa. And the market typically is highly variable. We saw that a couple years ago. You could sell a small square for $15 or so. You might only get $5 or so about that same quality hay now. And in a couple years, with the price of beef, if it continues to go up, you might get a little bit better with the price of some of your other end use animals. It might go down. You just never know. It's a lot more volatile of a market because it is more specialized. It is all about quality. And that's the other thing, is that producing good alfalfa, usually on small acres, just might not be good enough. You're talking about needing high-end alfalfa to probably make it work and make it really feasible into your system. So when we move out of what you would call a standard or traditional niches and start once again thinking outside the box, I have to caution that you have to be careful, because we talked about the high investment cost of more of your traditional ag systems, and we say, well, with some of our specialty crop, they're meant for small acres. Maybe you don't need as high investment as far as infrastructure and mechanics go to really make it work. And sometimes that's correct, but sometimes the smaller equipment that's more specialized is just plain more expensive, because they have to manufacture it on a smaller scale, and there's not just mass scale productions of it. Sometimes they are more specific or more expensive, especially if it is more specialized. A pecan tree shaker, and we see here at the bottom half of the screen, you see a harvester used to harvest edamame. You're not going to use that for anything else. So specifically going for edamame harvest, that probably is a little pricey of a piece of equipment, strictly because the only use you're going to have for it is that edamame. So it's probably not mass produced on a more and have a wider inventory. And like I said, on the positive side, many of our specialty crops are more suited for small acres. We're not wanting to have 2,000 to 3,000 acres of something like edamame or some of our other dry edible beans we'll talk about, because the market just isn't there. The management's too intense, so you don't want to have it on large scale acres. So it kind of fits with that small scale mindset that we're talking about here today. So the question becomes, what's the drawback? The market is really the major drawback. Most of the time we're talking about a fairly narrow market, and the pressure of entry is pretty high. And we see that in that you really just have to meet the right people and get to know the right people and shake the right hands to really break into some of these markets. It's just kind of how it is. And one really good example of that is in today's industry, the bird food industry. It's a very, very high quality market that you could be able to break into with some of our more specialty crops. However, the bird food industry doesn't need an excessive amount of any of our individual crops. It just needs a little bit. And so getting on the right pages and, like I said, shaking the right hands is potentially one of the hardest things to do when getting into the more specialty market phase. The other thing is, once you start moving into specialty crops, the knowledge base is fairly limited. And it's not just the individual level or the producer and all that. It typically goes all the way up through the state level. Most of the time, a lot of the land grant institutions maybe aren't familiar with some of our more specialty crops as much as they are with a crop that they grow multiple millions of acres on a yearly basis. So some of those are a little bit of a learning curve, and the learning curve is going to be there. The biggest thing is that if you're starting to grow a new crop in the state or in a region, is that mistakes are going to be made. And if you can't afford those mistakes, then this is probably not a venture that you want to take, because you're going to lose some money in some areas or make some mistakes and maybe have some crop failures. And so can you survive with having those crop failures and making some of those mistakes? And I have to overly emphasize that we still live in Oklahoma. The environmental conditions are highly varied. Some things just don't work when we talk about highly drought, high cold, or very cold winters, very hot summers, kind of dry periods throughout. Something that might work in Arkansas or the Midwest or the Northeast just might not have a good fit here for Oklahoma. So we have to still make sure that our expectations are there and make sure that we kind of know what we're getting into bringing something into the state of Oklahoma. So when we start thinking outside the box, what we're trying to do here is always know that we're going to have risk. Risk is just a part of ag, but what we're trying to do is shift the reward from being a high-risk, kind of moderate but consistent reward to shifting to that more high-risk, high-reward system, because we're going to need that higher reward to kind of make all the right moves to offset the initial cost of the capital investment. Okay, and the big thing is that if you can get into the right markets, we've seen that 5 years ago, a lot of us thought that the farm to market or farm to table operations in the fresh markets were going to be almost like a fad. Well, we know now that's something that's sticking with us. We're going to have that farm to market or farm to table kind of as being a cornerstone of agriculture moving forward and moving into the future. So it's time for us to adapt as a industry and make sure that we're kind of fitting the needs of our end users and kind of focusing on a lot of those aspects. So when we actually get into the crops, like I said, there's a lot of potentials out there. I like a lot of our horticultural crops, like our tomatoes and fresh peppers and various other things. But what I wanted to do today is kind of introduce some crops that might not be on a lot of people's radar. And one of those is edamame. If you've gone to any restaurant in the last 5 years, you've gone to a couple of them, especially some of our Asian cuisines, more than likely you've seen edamame on the menu. It's become a very, very popular dietary staple in a lot of our cultures around the United States. Big push here in a lot of our more urbanized areas, and you see it a lot in a lot of those restaurants in Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Dallas, Fort Worth area, et cetera, et cetera. And we see that one of the biggest producers as far as a domestic edamame production is our neighbors right to the east of Arkansas. When they started growing edamame, if you're not familiar, it is essentially the same species as our traditional soybeans. And when they started growing it in the state, they actually used some of our conventional soybeans to kind of spur their edamame production. Those non-Roundup Ready or non-GMO soybeans were kind of where they started in trying to determine when do we plant it, how do we grow it, how do we harvest it, and that's kind of where things have gone. Since the industry's been so successful in the state, they've actually moved to actually have a variety development program that focused on smaller pod walls, bigger beans, more of a sweet flavor that has a little bit more creaminess to it than our traditional soybeans, which has a lot more starchy, higher protein, long-term storage material. When we look at management, it's essentially the same as soybean because it is soybean. Variety is very crucial, just like it is soybean. We have our maturity groups very similar to what we have in our soybean, but because it is a kind of a new crop and kind of more of a niche market, we are very limited on our varieties. I think there is 2 Group 4s and 1 Group 5 that is being produced out of Arkansas. But you have to know that the seed is pretty costly. It's just supply and demand. Arkansas is just growing in their edamame production, so the growers over there are vigorous for the seed. And so breaking into this industry might be a little bit more of a challenge, but if you can kind of get into it, you can kind of break in and have a nice little system on your hands. There is specialized harvest. You can't just run a combine through it. You can't have your neighbor just run a combine through it. Most of the growers, whenever they first started, were looking at hand harvesting of this edamame. We're talking about food grade beans. And so we're looking at U.S. #1 soybeans that have very little mechanical damage to it. We are having to harvest these things green. So once again, you can't just thresh them out through a combine. And we want very little damage, not only to the bean themselves in the pods, but most of the time you want very little pod damage as well. So a little bit of a catch-22 there that you're going to have to go. The other thing for a small market or a small acreage is that you have to market through one individual source, and that's the American soybean industry, American Varietal Soybean and Edamame Incorporated, I do believe is what the company is called. They're the ones who you would buy the seed from. They're the ones who you would sell the seed back to, or the finished product. And so breaking into something like that, which is run through a single industry that works on contracts and works on contracted prices and various things like that, can be quite difficult. But edamame is a growing industry. We see it growing quite substantially in the next couple of years. Very similar to edamame is sesame. It's not as specialized as it has been in the past. About 5 years ago, they were moving sesame out of the south central, southwest Texas, and it was somewhat of a specialized crop for most of the rest of the industry. But with the continued increasing of successful operations, especially in the state of Oklahoma, it's not as much of a specialized crop anymore, more of a traditional crop, and as such has the challenges associated with a traditional crop. Some of those being weeds that we can't control. We have very few herbicides available for us that can control our broadleaf weeds, such as our mare's tail, our pigweed, our water hemp. You're talking about cocklebur, anything like that. We have a lot of challenge controlling those in a sesame crop. And then when you look at drawbacks within a system, the benefit is that you can use our traditional equipment to plant the sesame. The drawback is that you use traditional equipment to plant sesame, which means that the initial cost or the investment, unless you have a neighbor that's willing to come and help you out, it can be a little bit higher. And the other thing is that we're having to be a lot more precise than wheat. Like David said, we're wheat farmers, so we have equipment that's set up for wheat a lot of times. Sesame is a lot smaller seed, so it's the same issue we had with canola a couple years ago, is that if you have cracks or holes or various other things in your planter, your combine, your grain trailers, anything like that, what you're essentially going to be doing is just losing product on the ground. Very similar to the edamame. You buy your seed through a company called Sesico. You sell the seed back through a company called Sesico. Okay, so it's a very closed market. They set contract prices. Most of the time, these contract prices are grower friendly. You know, we'll give you this much per pound of sesame, indifferent on how much you grow. So you know at the beginning of the year how much you have. It's just up to the grower to be able to produce that much. The unfortunate thing is smaller acres or new growers usually get smaller contract prices than more established or more wide-scale growers. It's just because they don't want, if they can fill their need with X amount of contracts, they don't want to fill that same need with X times 100 to get a lot of the smaller contracts on smaller acres. So it's a business investment and a business decision on their end. But if you're looking at small scale agriculture, it is something that could work because it's pretty easy, pretty self-sufficient as long as you can overcome some of the initial hurdles. Now we're getting into ones that are more kind of outside the box or outside the system. Mung beans have one of the best potentials for the state, and it's because Oklahoma has historically been one of the primary producers of mung beans in the United States. And very similar to what we'll hear, it practically is a soybean. It managed like a soybean. It kind of looks like a soybean. When you look at it from the turn row, you have to glance at it twice to just know that it's not a soybean. So essentially what I always tell growers is it's a soybean in a better heat and drought tolerance package. And so that just kind of is a win-win. We've seen soybeans grow really well in the state of Oklahoma. The problem we always say is that it's not drought tolerant and it's not heat tolerant. Well, mung beans are. And once again, it's very, very similar to soybean, is that you will need more traditional based equipment. So you're going to have to go that route for some, but very similar to soybean. It's a lot more flexible than something like sesame is with traditional. The beans are larger. They're planted a lot more flexible. You can plant them at a half inch, an inch, inch and a quarter, and you still should be able to get pretty good stand up. It's not as precise as something like sesame that needs a lot of play to it. The other thing is we see here on the picture, it goes really well with our wheat systems. If you wanted to have wheat because the grower just wanted to look like an Oklahoma farmer and have wheat out there, you could come back in on the back end, plant mung beans, make it through that summer, and make a pretty good, decent crop for it. So what's the catch? Well, the seed cost is probably one of the biggest issues. It's typically 150 to 200% of the cost of soybeans. So if we're talking about soybean being about $20 an acre to plant, we're probably looking at $40 or so an acre to plant our mung beans. And so that's a big challenge to overcome because this is an annual crop, so you have to plant it annually. It's not like our pasture systems we talked about earlier. The market is also very narrow. We're talking about food-based industry, and oftentimes our market is fresh market. We see most of our mung beans are used in sprouts. And so salads, soups, various other dietary restriction. It's a great replacement for animal protein for our vegan and our vegetarians out in this world. So it has a market, but it's very narrow. And because it is in a food market, and that is the primary way to do it, lower quality seed is not acceptable. We're talking about the highest quality seed, especially since it's eaten as the primary seed. The other thing is, because the primary use is sprouts, we have to have good germination coming out of the field. If you get bad germination, you'll typically get docked for it, and really can be quite detrimental to the system. Lower quality seed can be moved into the cattle industry. However, because you need about 1.5 pound of mung beans to be equivalent to 1 pound of soybean as far as an animal protein equivalent, what we actually see is that if you have to move all of your mung beans to the animal industry because of your cost of seed and because of everything else going into it, more than likely you're going to lose money. And so it's something that we need to go into the fresh market. It's good. It's a good way to supplement maybe some of your fresh market beans and to go into the animal industry, but it's something we can't rely on exclusively, or else you're essentially going to be out of money. And the big thing is that you need to have an outlet identified or have a good contract in place for mung beans because they are somewhat expensive. You need to just have something ready before you plant those in season. Going on to something else, this is one that's actually made a big splash in the state. It's kind of moving in from the southwest, and we're seeing a lot of interest in it, is guar. Has great potential for the state. Research has suggested Oklahoma can achieve the best dryland yields of any state that produce guar. Now, it's not to say that we achieve the best. Texas and New Mexico typically achieve better yields than we can in guar, but all those are irrigated. And so we have the potential to make a cheaper product, maybe not as high yielding, but a much cheaper input cost, and really that makes it on the back end get a little bit better. Management, like I said with the mung beans, very similar. It's actually better drought and better heat tolerant than our mung beans, so we're kind of working down that scale. All planted with the same equipment as traditional ag. So once again, very similar to the mung beans on this perspective. As far as marketing, seed cost will be higher than that of soybean, but lower than that of mung bean. We're probably talking about 100%, about 25% more expensive than a soybean. And so we're a little bit higher. A lot of that seed comes out of Lubbock. And so we have some nice quality seeds, some good quality varieties out there that we have available. And our marketing is twofold. The first and our primary one is guar gum. If you're not familiar with guar gum, the biggest market for our guar gum is in the oil and natural gas industry. Uses a lot of guar gum. Now, the market is down a little bit for guar because oil and natural gas is down, but when we see that kind of turn around and get a lot more active again, we're going to see the cost of guar gum be a lot higher, and therefore the end-use product of guar being a lot better. The other thing we're looking at right now is actually being as good of a forage source as alfalfa is, and really can produce the good tonnage, good nitrogen content. The only question we have right now is the palatability, because we need those pods to be out there to get those nitrogen source. It seems as of right now that we're getting good consumption from the cattle industry as well as from the dairy industry. Those dairy cattle need those high protein feeds, and so something like guar could definitely fit that bill. So those are kind of some of the crops that we have potential that maybe aren't necessarily on everybody's radar as far as being able to grow in the state, but we can. So the question is, why can't we just grow things organic? Like David said, we typically can get a higher price for it. So why don't we just go that way? Well, the answer is you can. It brings a lot of value-added products to a small acre producer, but you need to know your limitations, and you need to know exactly what you're getting into. Like David said, it's a long process to get certified. You're talking about 3+ years of being able to be certified. It is somewhat costly. There are cost share programs, like David said, but they are very competitive, and so it is a big thing. The one thing that I hold on the organic thing is that there needs to be a market available. We had a lot of folks switch in soybean production to get a more organic-based soybean on some smaller acres because they had the cattle industry up in Missouri and in the Boot Hills say, hey, we need some organic feed to feed our organic cattle. Well, they were able to switch knowing that there was a market available. Just going and deciding at the drop of a hat, I'm going to switch to organic without having a good market and a good cropping system identified can be quite detrimental and actually can be a very costly endeavor. So kind of know that market when you're getting into organic, know kind of where they're going. Talk to your producers about, what do you actually want to achieve? What's your farm goals? What are you wanting to get out of that? And that kind of will help guide whether organic is actually a good plan or not. But it is a great option for that small scale producer to add that value added. So for my aspect, to kind of summarize in some conclusion, can we do a traditional crop on small acres? We've said no, but the answer really is yes. I mean, we can get really good, milo and corn yields on small acres, but you need to know your limitations. You really have to work on quality more than quantity, because the cost of large-scale production, you have to offset that cost with sweat equity. You really have to make something work. So when you shift to organic corn production, organic soybean production, or if you just want to say, hey, I want to do a really good job doing really high quality crop, then you have that sweat equity that you have to kind of put in. On small scale systems, forage and animal operations might be your best options. You don't need a whole lot of room for animals, and you don't need a whole lot of room for forages. And like I said at the start, you can typically get a whole lot higher per acre cost return on something like horticultural fruit and vegetables into that fresh market system. Once again, that's sweat equity that you have to put into it. Our more cropping systems still have viability, but you need to be a heck of a good salesman and a good marketer to kind of make that work. And so that kind of concludes what I have. Rod, do you want to say any last things or questions?
Yeah, we'll open it up for any questions. Please type them into the chat box. Finally, here on this last slide, each of us have listed some contact information. Our email addresses first. We have some other resources there. For example, the e-farm management resource website that Brent listed down there in the chat box. We also have listed here on the final slide. We have an OSU Farm Management Facebook page where we, if you'd like to like that, team up with that, you'll get periodic updates. And Dr. Marburger and Dr. Lofton have also listed their email addresses as well as websites and other useful links. The last thing that we would like for you to do as participants, we would like for you to take a very short survey. The survey link is listed there on the bottom of the last slide. I believe if you click on that, it will take you to the Qualtrics survey, and Brent has posted that in the chat box as well. So with that, I'll leave it open for any questions that pop up in the next minute or so, and if we don't have any questions, we'll call that good for this webinar. Thank you very much for your participation.